My name is Olaf. I'm a solutions architect on our professional services team, and I want to talk a little bit about PII data, set the stage a little bit about why it may matter, and then in more detail how it pertains to the data that you guys are sending to Sumo, right? With new regulations, sort of coming out in the last couple of years, I think this topic becomes more and more important. So this here is the description of personal data from the GDPR framework. I'm not going to read the whole thing, so I'm going to give you a second to read it. What stands out to me when reading this is, for one, it's really ambiguous, and it can mean many, many different things. So it's not entirely clear how to interpret this. I believe at the end of the day, everybody, in terms of GDPR, is sort of waiting for the first couple of companies that get caught up in something to see how the courts rule and how this law ultimately gets interpreted. But for us, what this means is, as it relates to PII data, it could mean many, many different things. And I think the scope of this data is going to grow and grow as these new regulations come out. And ultimately, that's going to matter to you for the data that you have in your own systems, as well as the data that ultimately flows to us on the back end of that process. So I think my main goal for this session was to, for one, talk a little bit about these new frameworks so we understand what it is that we have to look out for in specific cases. Like just to set the stage. The second step, of course, what do we do inside Sumo, both from a detection of PII data, what are some options to remediate, right? To comply with some of these new rules that you may have to comply with. And that's sort of the three takeaways from this session. Okay, so what's PII data? There are many, many regulatory frameworks out there. I've focused on two newer ones. They're very similar, as you'll see as I go through these. The reason I picked these two is because they are the most restrictive, or from a consumer perspective, actually, they offer the greatest protection, right? Ultimately, all these new regulations aim at protecting people, the consumers, your customers, from all of the data that is being collected about them, right? So the first one I want to point out, and there's of course many others, right? We can talk about all the compliance frameworks and regulations you may care about. I just picked the two newest ones and most interesting ones because everybody's talking about them. So the first one is the California Consumer Protection Act. That is not yet in effect. It's a law that just passed recently. It actually becomes effective in January of 2020, so we have a little bit of time. What it basically affects is anybody that does business with anybody living in California, right? So it probably affects most, if not all of us. If you have any customers in California, they fall under the scope of this framework or of this law, if you will. There are many, many things about this, but it boils down to a few key components. The first one is the right to know from a consumer perspective. So the consumer has the right, or you have to inform the consumer when and where and what kind of data you are actually collecting about them. They have the right to opt out for this data collection. So they can ask you to not collect said data. And what's interesting here is that even if they opt out, they have the right for equal service and price for the products or services that you guys offer. So you cannot discriminate against someone who tells you to not collect their personal data. This list is by no means exhaustive, but what constitutes personal information, that's how they call it here under this framework. Of course, anything related to names in combination with other data, right? Addresses, identification numbers, whatever it may be. Interesting here, I think, is the combination of a username and a password to access any sort of account. That is considered PII or personal information, probably not the most relevant from a Sumo perspective. but probably relevant for your own data sets that you store in your systems. Lots of different medical information, information about health insurance. All of that could be considered personal information. Another high-level bullet here, geolocation data, of course. Everybody thinks IP address here, but it could also be coordinates from GPS devices or anything like that, right? So, the third one here I thought was interesting because that basically in summary says IoT, right? If I have a thermostat at my house and I set the temperature to 70 degrees, depending on how you interpret this paired with other information, that may be something that could be interpreted as identifying me personally. So very wide-ranging, very open to interpretation, if you will. So these are sort of a few of the things that this law lists as things that fall under the category. The second framework, of course, everybody's been talking about it for 2 years now, is GDPR. It's actually very similar to the previous one in that its main aim is to protect consumers, people, mainly anybody that's European, right? So I'm German. Even me living in the US, everybody that knows anything about me, that still falls under the scope of GDPR, even though I don't live in Europe, I don't work in Europe, and most of the stuff I use isn't in Europe. It still applies to me from that perspective. So very similar. What are some of the rights? In this case, we are called data subjects, which I find very interesting. But yes, we have to be informed when personal data is being collected from us. There is this concept of the controller and the processor. The controller in most cases is you as the people collecting the data. The processor could also be you, it could be us, it could be other downstream systems vendors that you're using. But the controller is the person mainly responsible to adhere to these rights for the data subjects, which again is all of us. So we have to tell people what data is being collected. We have to grant people access to this data if they request it, so they have the ability to see what it is that is being collected. Ironically, they have the right to rectification. So if you're collecting data that's either incomplete or wrong, they can request that you complete this data or correct it if after they've seen it. And then, of course, the right to erasure or right to be forgotten, like it's called, and they can request that you guys get rid of all of the data that has been collected by this subject. The quote at the beginning of the presentation was the definition of personal data under the GDPR framework. Here are just some examples. They break this down. I mean, as you saw in the quote, basically anything or any combination of things, names, addresses, identification numbers, all of the above, right? All of that constitutes personal data. I think we'll have to wait and see how it plays out in real life, how that's going to affect us. Interesting here is they also have what they call special data categories. So these are things that are not directly relating information to you, but sort of peripheral, if you will. The first one is anything that has to do with biometric or genetic or health-related data and could be considered personal. More interestingly, data revealing race or ethnic origin, right? Religious or political beliefs. So if, for example, we'll see an example later, union memberships are considered potentially identifiable, and it's something that falls under these rights that we just talked about. And then, of course, also anything revealing sexual orientation or gender or anything like that. On the bright side, all of these frameworks, and this is specific to GDPR, but all of these frameworks actually have exceptions to them. The first three here, national defense, national security, defense, and crime prevention, probably not something any of us can really claim, depending on the business we're in. But those may be overriding interests where the law no longer applies. There is of course many other regulatory frameworks that you guys may be adhering to. Some of those will override the GDPR standard as well. For example, in banking, you have to keep data for 7 years, that you still have to do. So even if a bank was storing certain information, a subject could request it be deleted, but the bank doesn't have to because the other regulation trumps what GDPR does. So there's a lot of competing requirements there. And then I put this in here because it's interesting from our context. There are many other receptions. They're listed in recitals inside the framework. If you are operating a security operations center and collect data as part of that in order to protect your environment and your infrastructure and your data, that is an overriding interest, and that does not apply to the rest of the GDPR framework. I mentioned that because, of course, a lot of people are using Sumo for purposes like that. So that may be one way out from a Sumo perspective. Okay, so what does that mean in Sumo? And the way I want to look at this is looking at the life cycle of a log message, right? Before we get into the life cycle itself, just want to quickly talk about sort of what are the main offenders where we see this a lot. I want to prefix this by saying, based on the definitions here and how wide these are, I think you can potentially find this data anywhere. So these are by no means the only places you should look. But the main place where we find information that is considered PII or sensitive or may fall in scope of any of these frameworks is, of course, application logs, right? Sometimes that data gets written there on purpose because you're logging certain information for business reasons or just because. Sometimes that data makes it in there not on purpose because stuff gets dumped as part of a stack trace into the logs where you're not even, you're not purposefully logging it, but it's whatever was held in code at the time. Exception occurs, it gets dumped in there. So just because you know what you're logging, from a code-based perspective, doesn't necessarily mean that the data doesn't ultimately make it in. So and that's in essence why we're having this talk, right? And then of course, from a standard logs perspective, we see a lot of web access logs that contain this data, predominantly in the URL parameters section of these logs. And I'm not talking about IP addresses here, right? I'm talking about the more interesting stuff. And then at the end of the day, any other log can potentially contain information that you may want to know about. So if we're looking at options of how to control this, right? We'll talk about identifying if you have any of this data here in a second. But if you look at the life cycle of a message, it gets generated, it gets ingested into Sumo, it gets indexed, and then at some point, based on retention, for example, it gets deleted. So, of course, in an ideal world, we prevent this data from ever leaving your premises if that's what you're trying to do, right? If you want to make sure certain things never show up or never leave your premises, then we would ideally want to prevent them from coming in altogether. So there's, in essence, two main approaches to doing so. The first one is a Sumo approach, and that's what we call processing rules. So for every source that you configure to ingest data, it doesn't matter if it's a hosted source or if it's a source that's living on your end on one of our collectors, we have this concept of processing rules where we can apply regular expressions to the data that is coming in and then choose different actions if any of these patterns are being found in any of the messages that you're sending. It says here, so if I use this example here, right, this regular expression up there matches an IP address, right? I can put that in as a filter or processing rule, and then I can decide if I find a message that has this pattern, what do I want to do with it? The first option is to hash, which means I can hash this value. It's an MD5 hash for that IP address. I can mask the value. That's the example here in the bottom, where I can, in essence, overwrite the value with some static string that I choose. That has the advantage, if you're doing this, that you can actually leverage this to find if you have any logs that contain certain information later, because this is a string that you can later in Sumo obviously search for very easily, right? So, yes?
Sorry, when you hash the message under GDPR, is that going to be considered Because you still can identify the person you just don't know who. And kind of
If it depends on the value, I think.
the same username, same IP address is going to generate the same hash, right? So it's,
Yes, it's an MD5 hash. It could be reverse engineered. That's correct. So the question is for GDPR, is an MD5 hash good enough or not, right? I don't think so, right? But I also think it depends on what the field is, right? If it's an IP address, probably yes, because the IP address without additional information isn't necessarily good enough to identify you personally. But in that case, you don't need to hash it either, right? In that case, you're good from the get-go. But I would err on the side of caution until some of these cases play out, just to see how things are being interpreted, right? But yeah, we can mask, has the benefit that we can then search for this stuff and see if anything has ever bled into the logs that we didn't know about. We can also exclude the messages altogether, meaning we're not even sending them to Sumo, so they never leave your infrastructure altogether if you want to do that. Of course, that poses the problem if you have competing requirements, then you may be violating those because you're not collecting all the data pertaining to that. And then, of course, the second approach is sometimes you have obviously control over what's being logged, right? So if it's your own code, you obviously have a lot of autonomy over what you do there, so you can tighten things up there. And even for standard software, most tools today, you can adjust what's being logged and how it's being logged, so you can tune things there. So that's basically prior to ingestion. That's probably the preferred approach for all of us. So what if data actually gets into Sumo? What do we do then? What are our options there? The first option, and again, it depends a little bit on what you're going after, is retention. Many people have different retention periods for different data sets. For example, if you had a GDPR request to delete certain data, that thing has a long tail, so it's not going to happen the second you ingested the data. So it may be from a retention perspective that data is long gone before that request ever reaches you, at least the data in Sumo, right? If you have only 30 days retention on that data set, by the time that request reaches you, the Sumo problem is already gone, right? Because the data falls off the tail end. If you have long retention periods, of course, it's a different story. But we have started to see customers actually adopt indexing/retention schemes specifically to make sure that the data sets with potentially sensitive data have very short retention periods. So that way the stuff falls off the back and you never actually run into a problem. By the time the request gets their data is gone already. We can also hide log data, which in certain circumstances probably sometimes may be good enough, right? You can do some of this yourself by using our RBAC roles, where you can basically drive who can see what data. From an individual message perspective, this is rather limited, and there's always still administrators in the system that could see everything, so that probably not always will do the trick, but it's a first filter, if you will. Secondly, we have this option where our engineering team puts in backend filters that hides certain data sets from anybody in your organization. So that de facto makes the data disappear. It no longer becomes searchable. We think that from a GDPR perspective, that may be good enough, right? Because the data is there, but nobody can find it. And then again, retention still applies there. There's also the option of deleting data. This is not a publicized option from our end, but you can request the deletion of data. We cannot delete individual log messages. I want to make that very clear. We can delete data in indexes, so depending on how your data is indexed. And I think the lowest granularity is in 10-minute chunks, right? So if you had if you had a little bit of data bleed in, you could identify what sort of those time ranges where the data could be removed, but it would remove all the other data in that index in that same time range as well, right? So we cannot delete individual messages at this time. All right, so first step is, if you have certain requirements and you're actually interested to see what that scope of that would be in Sumo, right? The first thing you need to figure out is what do I actually have in my logs? Do I even have an issue from a Sumo perspective? We have built some dashboards. I will show you some screenshots of those later. They're on GitHub, and it's our privacy insights sort of app, if you will. The approach that we take there is very similar to what I'm talking about here. But we want to identify different pieces of PII data with different mechanisms. First and foremost, we have keywords, right? There's certain things, like if you look for the keyword name or first name or sure name or any of these permutations as you have here, that could be used as part of a log message as the key to the value, right? A name is not something that's easy to find with a regex, for example, because there's no distinct pattern to it. You would have way too much noise compared to your signal. You can also look for values, right? Here I'm using religions as an example, right? If you find any of these permutations of these strings in your logs, then that could indicate that you're storing this in relationship to one of your users or something of that nature. So that's one approach. And then the second one is looking for patterns, very similar to what we do at Ingest. Of course, not everywhere can we apply these patterns. Where they work well is, of course, numbers, right? Things like social security numbers, I'll show you an example later, or any other numbers where there's some sort of rule set around how they're being constructed. And we can probably identify those without too much noise. I'll speak about that in a second as well. Email addresses, fairly easy. IP addresses, right? Very, very structured and defined sets of values and patterns. And then there's the question of dates. I'll speak about the dates a little bit more later. They're obviously the trickiest part, because especially in the logging world, because log messages always contain dates, right? But I'll get to that in a minute. So, social security numbers, as an example, how could we approach identifying them? We could use keywords or literals to find in our logs if we were using some sort of key value pair logging mechanism, right? SSN, social security number, and then different permutations of how that key value pair could be built. This list goes obviously on and on, so there's a little bit of an exploration exercise in terms of your logs here. Good news here, there's also regexes. Up here you see this is a built-out regex for social security numbers. This is part of the Insights app. And there's some rules to it, that's why it's not just a few numbers with dashes in between. There's certain rules, that numbers, so these two numbers you see up here, for example, they can't be valid social security numbers. The one was used in some sort of TV advertising, so they reserved it for that, and the other one was actually found in a breach of some sort, so they banned that number altogether as well. But there's other rules as part of this regex, how a social security number can be composed. So this regex captures that. We typically would run this in two versions, once with the dashes, once without, just in case, right? Because you want to, like I talked earlier at the beginning, cast a wide net. Going to find a lot of noise, but you want to make sure that you don't miss anything. Risks here, or things to look for, are false positives, and this is going to be almost always the case in this exercise. This regex above, if you run that against a real production data set, it will, especially the second one, it will match a lot of timestamps, which is of course all noise, right? And then there's also other numbers where the patterns are very similar to regexes, but that's part of the process, is to, as I said, cast a wide net, see what you can find, and try to exclude all the noise, ideally ending up with only either I found something real or I didn't, but that's part of the exercise of doing this. Second example, dates. And I like this one because it's the most complicated one. So dates predominantly matter probably, for birthdays, but I could see under GDPR how things like start of employment dates or any contract start date in some context may matter. The problem with dates for us is, of course, dates show up in every one of our log messages by default. It's one of the main pieces of information about the log message. So here, We would probably start by using keywords, different permutations of different spellings of the same value. We can also use regexes. Of course, that's going to produce, if you just look for some date format, year, day, month, or whatever date format you have, that's going to hit a lot of your messages potentially, because those contain those. The second regex here comes a little closer. What it basically does is it looks for a date without it having a time with it. Oftentimes the date stamp from a log message will contain both the date and the time when it occurred. If you're storing any sort of relevant date in this context, it's probably not going to contain the time and piece with it. So as long as, and this is just an example, right? What that basically does is say find any date that matches that format where there's no space with a digit behind it or with 2 digits. That would be the hour of any other timestamp, or note the word T, which a lot of timestamps come in like that. Again, there is many different permutations of this that you need to basically test out. The other issue with dates is the formatting. Social security number is fairly easy from a pattern perspective. Dates are easy too, but there's a million different date formats. If you don't know what you're looking for, you potentially got to test for every single one of them. Again, false positives. Most problems are probably going to come in with the actual timestamp of the log message that you're finding instead of actual dates. The last example, political mentions, for example, right? So this is something that under GDPR is potentially a problem. There's no regexes here, right? Because this could mean any combination of characters, short forms, long forms, different spellings, different languages. So what we would want to do here, is sort of apply an approach of finding any permutation of short and long form that we can think of, and use those as keywords against the data. You can see this example here, right? In a real life scenario, you would probably do this on a localized basis, meaning you're not going to list every political party that exists in the world in a single search, right? You would probably do this specific to certain geographies or countries or whatnot. Otherwise, this is going to be difficult. The main difficulty with this approach is that you got to identify all the different permutations of spellings that these things may come in, and that is probably a fairly tricky proposition. So this is the link to our public-facing GitHub. I'm just going to show you a few screenshots from the Insights app that is there. By no means is that all-encompassing, but you can download it from there, you can install it, and it's going to give you a good idea. If you wanted to start hunting for things in your logs, it would give you a good idea of how we would approach it, and then you can obviously customize it to whatever values you're looking for and whichever localization you may have. So the first one here is the overview dashboard that comes with it. Over here you can see a list of the dashboards that we just built out of the box. Again, there could be another 4 dozen added, no problem, if you look at all the different things that we now have to look for. And what it basically does is it looks through all your data. So it's not the fastest dashboard in the world, just from an expectation perspective. That's not its point. And then it basically looks for both the keywords and the patterns that we have added to these queries and identifies sources. In our case, we always look at this by metadata, right? The source category where this came in from, the source name, or the host. So you can start digging into these different data sets to validate that what the dashboard found is actually a value of interest. Most of the time it's going to be false positives, and then you got to just fine-tune the thing. Here's one with religious mentions. They all employ very similar, conceptually are all very similar. One with gender mentions. One specific to German passport numbers, right? And that goes back to, there's so many different things that we got to look for. We got to start somewhere, identify what's most important in our context, and then start there. And then last but not least, the way I would approach this is first and foremost, I would try to identify what do I actually care about, right? What am I worried about? Am I worried about a specific regulatory framework, a specific law, and what does that mean in my context ultimately, right? What's the biggest worry? Is it somebody requesting to be forgotten? Is it something else? Then of course leverage, some of these techniques, hopefully, to find some of the stuff in my logs to make sure, do I have this issue or do I not have the issue, and then go from there. And then of course download the app from GitHub and install it, see what it does. As you see how we're approaching this conceptually, it's very easy to modify it for different things. Maybe you don't care about German passport numbers, but you care about other passport numbers. Very easy to change. With that, any questions?
Question? Great.
Is there a plan for us ourselves to delete logs, or will it always go through you in order to do that?
So I don't know that I can answer that question. My guess is there's no immediate plan. There's also issues with that in the sense that the system was built for logs to be not permutable. Once logs become permutable, that has an entire string of consequences, for us. So I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, potentially could break some compliance
Exactly.
regulations as well.
We would lose some of our attestations if we allowed people to delete data. Right.
Other questions? As I was watching your presentation, I was thinking you could also use this data in a similar format for marketing types of applications. So collecting data about specific, age groups, sex ranges, geographical locations, et cetera. So the tool can be mined in many other ways. But
Yes.
aside from the security side, which is very important, especially if you're in the GDPR world, this is a problem that nobody's really solved well, but we've taken some steps to help make that a little bit easier. What other questions do folks have? Great.
It's a similar question, but I wanted to make sure I get this right. So once the data has been ingested, and it should not have been, for example, the only alternative is to actually delete the data. And with potentially unrelated data too, there is no other way to remediate this. Is that
So
correct?
if the goal is absolute deletion, then yes.
Or we can't modify and
Right, but one of the steps was not the deletion, but we can actually hide the data from any user in the backend, which means the data is not deleted, but the data is de facto gone because nobody can ever find it again, right? Now, is that good enough or not for a specific requirement? That's another story. But that is an option, and that's actually the option that most customers so far have opted for when they had stuff bleed into logs that shouldn't have bled in there, right? Because the deletion mechanism is not specific, so other stuff goes out the window too. Yes. Yes.
So can you help us understand when data expires, when the log files expire, what happens with them?
It gets deleted.
It's not being unsearchable, it gets deleted.
No, it
That's
gets deleted.
Gone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions? Okay, great job, Olaf. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.